Hello everybody, I am super excited to introduce you to my very first sewing pattern, the Sarah Crossbody. So a couple of things before we get started making everything. I have included both the pattern pieces and the measurements. The cut list has how many you cut and the measurements. I know you can't see that, I blurred that out because this is a paid pattern, and there'll be a link in the description below as to where you can pick up the pattern. You can not bother with the pattern pieces at all, but if you do use them, I suggest cutting out or printing page 13 first, and that's the one with the test square. Test your test square, and if everything lines up, then go ahead and print the rest of the pages. There are 6 pattern pages. The only thing not here is the strap. Now the strap is included on the AO file for those who want to use a projector or a copy shop. So it was really exciting learning how to do that. I learned a lot of things about the sewing community that I didn't know in the past couple of weeks from my testers, and they have been amazing. So whether you decide to use just the measurements or the pattern pieces, we'll proceed from here by cutting out all your pattern pieces if you're using them, and then using those or the measurements to cut out all of your pieces from your material choices. So I've recommended for this pattern a nice marine vinyl. You want something with a woven back that has some weight to it, not something that's really flimsy. If it's flimsy, I would suggest using some sort of stabilizer. Use whatever you would normally use. If you're not familiar with stabilizers, you can use fusible fleece, you can use foam. You can also use a product called Decaville Light, I think would work really well. And one of my testers, you can see in the Going Rogue section at the bottom of the pattern, actually used Decaville Light on her bag, and it worked beautifully for her. So once you have all of your pieces cut out in your desired materials, we're going to move forward with the rest of the bag. Oh, I forgot to mention lining. I'm also using waterproof canvas, an Ottertex canvas, for the lining of my bag. That way I don't have to interface it. But if you choose to use a really pretty cotton, quilting cotton or something like that, I would suggest using a woven interfacing on that, and I've included that on the cut list as well. So if you're using a cotton interface or cotton lining, you're going to want to have your woven interfacing to go along with that. So let's get to making this bag. So I have all of my pieces laid out here on my work surface. Now the first thing I want to do is put my zipper pulls on my zippers. So I have both of those here, and I'm going to pull over my handy zipper connecting contraption here, and I'm going to use it to go ahead and put on my zipper pulls. Now there are several ways that you can put your zipper pulls on. I have a video that shows how I use this, and there are a lot of videos out there. You don't have to have something like this or even any fancy contraption. You can put them on just by slipping the pull onto the zipper. I'm just not very good at that. So this is how I do it. There we go. There are both of my zipper pulls on my zipper tape. Now for this section, super easy, super quick. We're going to take our piece C, which is our zipper end, and lay it face down on, or face up on our work surface. And I'm going to grab a few clips because I'm going to do all of my clipping here. I'm going to do this sort of assembly line fashion. So I'm going to lay this down with the short end to the left and right, and then I'm going to lay my zipper pull, or my zipper tape, face down over that. I want the top side of my zipper to be facing the pretty side of my material. I'm going to line this up so that the short ends line up and the side also lines up. So I want this to be nice and straight. And I'm going to just put a clip right on the end. And I'm going to do that with all 4 ends. So once we have all of our pieces clipped, we're going to go ahead and stitch across the end at 1/2 inch. When you're getting everything set up here at the foot, just make sure that your sides are still aligned. I'm going to go ahead and pull my other one over and sort of assembly line this. Now I can clip my other one free and spin it around and keep going. I am back stitching at the beginning and the end of these. I just got these new snips and I'm still getting used to using them. That's a little close. Okay, so after you trim your threads out of the way, we're going to remove our clips. We don't need those now. And we're going to top stitch across each of these. So you're going to switch your stitch length to a top stitching length. You're going to fold your piece C back away from the zipper now, so you have it right side up on your surface, and top stitch at 1/4 inch across the end. I do a single back stitch at the beginning and the end, because that part is going to be within the seam allowance. Nobody's going to see it. So there we go. Our zipper panels are ready to be installed. This part is complete, and we're going to set this part aside and move on to the next step. All right, so now that you have your pieces gathered for this part, this is piece E, as well as your 12-inch zipper panel. You're also going to need something to measure with, something to mark your material with. I'm using this just a fine point red Sharpie. And I'm also using double-sided tape to connect everything together, but you can use clips as you see fit. And I'm also going to be using a stapler. And this is my basting tool of choice recently. It works really well for me, but you can use a needle and thread. You can glue the end of your zipper however you would normally do that. So let's start by prepping our zipper. So I'm going to set some of these things aside. So I'm going to take my zipper and separate the end. You can separate the whole thing, but I just separate the end to start with. Now about 1/2 inch, I'm going to fold it back on itself so that this is at about a 90-degree angle. It's okay if it's a little bit more than 90. So now I have this at the end. I don't know if you can see it. There we go. So to hold that together, I'm going to take my stapler and carefully, so that I don't hit my nail, I'm going to go in there and just pop a staple close to the edge. And that's just going to hold that in place while I stitch. You don't want it further down in the material, otherwise you could hit it with your needle or it could be exposed once you sew everything. So I'm going to do the same thing with the other side and kind of do it so that they match up. That looks pretty good. And there we go. The ends of my zipper are ready to go. I can go ahead and pull that apart. And that's just so that I know that this end is going to be, that if this end is even when I put it back onto the zipper, or when I put it onto the zipper pull, this end is going to come up even as well. That's the other reason I leave it together. So I can lay these aside, and now we're going to take our 4 recessed zipper panels and flip them over to the back side. And we're going to mark our line across the ends of the right side here. We're going to make sure we're doing this on the back side. Okay. Now I'm going to take my double-sided tape and place to the narrower side of that line that I just made. Now, if you don't have double-sided tape, then you can just fold that in and clip it, or you can use a little bit of Fabri-Tac glue, however you like to do it. I just personally like doing it with the double-sided tape. I'm kind of addicted to this stuff when it comes to sewing. It's so useful. Okay, now on the front side of two of them, the opposite end of where my line is, so I'm just going to fold these into the line. We're not folding on the line, we're folding to the line. I've recently discovered that's so much easier than folding on the line, because once you start folding, you can't see where the line is anymore. What do you think of these? I've made sure that this end is lined up because I want those folded ends to match up once everything is put together. That I can definitely see. So now I'm going to kind of push those apart and I'm going to grab my zipper pieces. So I'm going to put double-sided adhesive down the side that the mark is on, just to the long side, not in the short side. I don't need it down there. You could put it all the way across, but it's just unnecessary. So there's my two pieces. Now, this part is important as well. You want your zipper with your pretty side, not the back side, the pretty side facing up. And we're going to place them like this along that edge. So it's going to look wrong. It's not, I promise. I'm going to start with this side. Being careful not to rub off my chalk, and I'm just going to line this up with my teeth at that mark that I made, and my tape right on the edge of the material. If your zipper is nice and straight and you're not stretching it as you put it on, you're going to have a very nice and straight zipper in your finished project. I'm just going to press that down and then do the other side. Nice and straight. Okay, this is where our other two panels are necessary. We're going to want to make sure that our folded in is going to line up with the other folded in, and our adhesive is going to be on the same side as the zipper tape. So our folded in needs to line up, and our top edge needs to line up. So that one is ready to stitch. We'll go ahead and get this one put together. I like to make sure that folded edge is even first and then go across. Okay, now we're ready to sew. So we're going to stitch up the side that isn't folded and across, stopping at the folded edge, back stitching at the beginning and the end. We're going to do the same thing with both panels at a normal stitch length and 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now that we've stitched across this side and across the top, I'm going to trim away my corner material just so that I can turn this out and have a nice, neat corner. So there is that bit, and again on this side. So now we're going to turn this out and then we're going to top stitch. can use whatever tool you want to use to make sure that your corner is nice and neat. Don't be too rough with it. You might poke a hole through your stitches or something like that, and we don't want that. So look, there's a nice little corner there. I'm going to go ahead and turn out the other piece, and then we'll top stitch. Okay, so top stitching, you want to have the top side of your zipper facing up. So on this one, we're going to go from this side down the end, and then we're going to sew down this side as well just to secure it in place. And then I like to run a line of stitches across the bottom just to hold the piece flat. So I'm rolling out my seam and making sure that it's sitting nicely, and I'm going to be stitching at 1/8 of an inch using a top stitch length. I am going to back stitch. Nobody's going to see it. It'll be within the seam allowance. I'm going to make sure that I'm ending right there at 1/8 of an inch. So at this point, I'm going to put my finger inside it and just push that zipper tape out with my finger, making sure everything is laying nice and flush. So just work a little bit at a time as you go. Pushing that edge out and making sure everything is laying nice and flat. You want to make sure your needle's down whenever you stop to make adjustments. That way everything stays where it's supposed to. If your needle is up, your fabric has the option of shifting, and then you could have a wonky seam. We don't want wonky seams. So I'm going to stitch down this side, and this is going to secure that in closed. I'm going to go ahead and go back just a little bit, so I'm 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. And I'm going to turn and just sew across the bottom. And there is one side of our recessed zipper panel ready. Go ahead and do the other side. Now this side, we're going to stitch from the other end so that we're top stitching on the correct side. We want the pretty side of our zipper facing up, because the pretty side of the top stitching is always the part that comes from the top of the machine, not from the bobbin. So I'm going to line up those edges at that corner there. And now I'm going to do the same thing as I did the other side, or with the other piece, and just make sure that everything is laying nicely before I stitch across. And down the side. And I'm going to go ahead and stitch across the bottom, just making sure everything is nice and flat. And there we are. Our recessed zipper panel is ready to be installed in the bag, so we can set this bit aside and move on to the next step. So the first thing we're going to do is join our pieces together. Now it doesn't matter which one of these you start with, so I'm just going to grab the one that's closest to me. And positioning these right sides together at a 45-degree angle, we're going to stitch from this corner to this corner. And I'm going to go ahead and mark that. Grab a clip to put on that so it's not wiggling around on me. So I'm going to line this up with my grid mat so that I know I'm going 2 inches over. Grab a longer ruler. So I'm just going to sew right across that line. And I'm going to open it up and top stitch just as I did with the other strap. So let's go over to the machine and connect this. So the battery on my mic died in the middle of that, so I'm not sure how much you heard, but we top stitched down both of the sides of this, pressing the seam allowance open. I'm going to trim that back just along that top stitching line. And now we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to place my accent material down. Just grab a clip. And then I'm going to take my other strip. This is going to be a very long piece of material. And right sides together at a 45-degree angle, the exact same way we did the last one. I'm going to clip that. Line it up on my mat. And mark a line right across there at 45-degree angle. And I'm going to repeat the same process that I did for this join. And I'll meet you right back here at the counter. All right, now we're ready to start putting our strap together. Now we have a very, very long piece of material here. So it's fine if you want to kind of work in sections. I like starting from the right end. I don't know why. It doesn't matter which end you start from. Now I'm going to mark a line down the center just so that I can be sure that I'm lining everything up the way it should be and it doesn't get off and skew in any way. So I'm going to use my long ruler and start making that line all the way down the entirety. Now if you're using a light colored material or a woven material for your strap, you may want to use disappearing ink or chalk or something that will brush away. I don't mind using just a ballpoint pen on the back of vinyl because it is not going to show through. So just be mindful of what you're using. I'm not even worried about the back of the white vinyl because it is actually a little bit thicker than my black vinyl. Alright, so I've marked all the way down the center of my strap. And now I'm going to grab my wide double-sided adhesive and I'm just going to put one strip right down the middle of it. And I'm just going to run it right down that line. Okay, now that I have that done, I'm going to start pulling this back just a little bit at a time and bringing those edges into meet. Now I'm going to go ahead and clip those in place as I go. Now you want this to meet but not overlap. On this one, I'm just going to trim it back and fold down. The same way I did on the instructions on the other strap. You can use the same illustration. It's just not going to get folded in half again. This method is a lot of strap material to get through, but I promise it will pay off in the end because this is a really cool method. It's actually one of my testers who told me about this, and I decided to add it to the pattern because I know some folks might like it. So I'm going to work my way doing this for the rest of the strap, and I will meet you back in the next step. Okay, so this is where we're at. Like I said, a whole lot of material. So I want to prepare my ends so that they're nice and clean and I don't have to worry about raw edges. So I'm going to take my ruler and mark 1/2 inch from the end. And I'm going to trim that back. All the way over to the side. And then cut it at an angle. The same on the other side. And now this is going to get folded right down over the end. So the outside, there's a nice clean edge on it. I'm going to do the same thing with the other side. And there we go. Now, this is where things start to get a little more fun. So we have to thread our swivel clasp all the way to the middle of that strap past all those clips. Now, if you don't feel the need to clip yours, you don't have to. I'm always afraid mine's just going to pop back open. So I'm going to take one of my swivel clasps, and with the clasp itself toward the pretty side, not the side that has the folds, I'm going to thread it on and put my clip back in place. So I'm just going to keep threading it past all these clips until it's in the middle. And the middle is going to be somewhere in my accent piece. So at this point, I have my swivel clasp right here on my accent piece. I'm going to start pulling this in half, keeping everything nice and straight, and line up my ends with the back sides together. So I'm going to start down here at the end. Take off one of those clips, line them up, and just clip both sides together. Making sure everything is nice and even. So now you can see here, your accent piece is not going to be even. It's going to be further up on one side than it is the other. That's the way it's supposed to be. So I've got all those clips off. I'm going to pull my swivel clasp all the way down to the very end and pop a clip right there, making sure everything is still very much even. And now we get to stitch the strap together. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to top stitch right across here at the clasp, and then I'm going to top stitch down both sides. So I will see you over at the machine. Alright, so we have our strap here. It doesn't matter which side we top stitch on, but I'm going to go ahead and do it on the side with the longest bit of accent material. And I'm going to put the right side of my presser foot just where the clasp ends. I'm still getting used to those snips. I'm going to go ahead and heat seal that. Okay, now I'm going to top stitch down both sides of the strap, and I'm going to start from the clasp each time. So, I'm going to drop my strap into the floor between my legs, and I'm going to drop my needle down right where I stopped my stitching, which is about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the strap. Make sure everything stays nice and lined up. There's one side. I'm going to take care of the other side. We'll go back over to the counter. Okay, so for this part, we're going to take the free end of our strap, that's this end here, and with our slide adjuster, we're going to thread it up through the left side and down through the right side, like so. And we're going to leave some space here so that this is what we have. Alright, so we're at this point. We need to take our other swivel clasp and thread it on so that the back side is on the same side as the inside here. You want your outside to be on the outside, or your clasp to be on the outside. So I'm going to thread that on just like that, and then we're going to go up through the same side we started on last time and back down through the other side. So up the left side and back down the right side. I'm going to leave myself about 2 inches there, and we're going to go over to the machine and stitch that down. So at the moment we have a clasp here, we have our slide adjuster here, and we have a clasp here. Okay, let's go secure this. So I've extended my stitch length another click on my machine, and I'm going to stitch across here about 1/4 of an inch from the edge. Let me just grab my threads there so I can hold those down. And I'm going to go up about 1 inch from there and stitch again. Clip my threads and I'll meet you back over at the counter. Okay, so we can pull that tight over that. Kind of center our clasp onto this part, and there we have our completed alternate crossbody strap. So it doesn't really matter on this side which side is facing up. We have our nice finished end over on this side. And you can even add a rivet to that if you'd like. There we are. Next we're going to work on our strap connectors. So for this step, some of you are going to want to skip part of it, and I will let you know when that is when I get to it. The first thing I want to do is mark my center line down the back of my strips along the 4-inch edge. Okay, now down both sides of that. If you're using a wider tape, you can just put it down one side or down the middle and use that for both sides, but I'm using this narrower tape. So I'm just going to put a piece down both sides of the line that I just made on both pieces. And now we're going to fold both edges in to meet that middle line. So now we have two 1-inch strips that are 4 inches long. So now we're going to measure on the back to the middle. So 2 inches in, we're going to make a mark. Doesn't matter if you use ink or something like that right here, because nobody is going to see it. Except you. And anyone who's watching this video. Okay, so I've gotten the center designated here. Now, if you are not using rivets, I would suggest skipping the next part. I top stitch down both sides of mine because when I attach it to the bag, I'm just going to sew at the bottom and the top and then attach rivets to it to help hold it in place. If you're not using rivets, go ahead and skip ahead here because you're going to be sewing a box around it to secure. And you're not going to want 2 rows of stitching down the side, especially if you're using a contrasting thread like I am. But if you're using rivets, go ahead and follow along with me. Unless you prefer to use the box, by all means, go right ahead. I am back stitching. Nobody's going to see that. It's going to be folded in. Probably don't even have to back stitch, but it's my own peace of mind. Okay, so now we're going to put a piece of double-sided adhesive down both sides of that line. It doesn't have to be super close to it or anything. If you're not using double-sided adhesive, you can kind of skip this part and just go to the folding part. Secure with clips, however you need. So I'm going to take one side of my backing off and I'm going to fold the end down to meet that center line. And then I'm just going to stick a clip right across there. I like using the salon clips on this because they don't leave any little marks on the material. Now this side, I'm going to take my backing off and you're going to want to insert your D-ring or insert it into your D-ring. I'm using these triangle rings and then butt those ends up together and pop a clip on that. And that's what we're going to have at this point. Let's go ahead and do that same thing to the other side or to the other piece. Okay, now we can set these pieces aside and go on to the next step. Now we're going to make our slip pocket. So you're going to need your slip pocket piece, and for this to get started, we're just going to take it. It doesn't matter which way it's turned because it is a square. We're going to fold it in half, right sides together, and kind of finger press that top edge gently. It doesn't need to be crisp or anything because we're going to be turning it out. So if you want to pop a couple of clips on it to make sure it doesn't wiggle around or anything, you're welcome to do that. I'm going to actually mark my turning gap, which is only going to be about 4 inches. So what I'm going to do is stitch at a 1/2 inch seam allowance down one side, across, back stitch after I skip my gap, go to the corner and back up the other side, back stitching at the beginning and the end. So 1/2 inch seam allowance with a normal stitch length. And when I say normal, I mean normal for whatever material you're using. It'll be different depending on what machine you're using and what material you're using. Go ahead and trim all your threads out of the way. Now we're going to trim away our corners. And turn out our work. And I'm going to take mine over to my pressing mat and press it once I get all of my edges turned out nicely. I want some nice crisp corners and the edges pushed out, all the seams pushed out around the edge. So if you have something like this is a bone folder. This is one of my book bonding tools. If you have the older model Cricuts came with a green one had a metal tip on it. A bone folder is a very good tool. It's a useful tool in sewing because you can get up in there and kind of give those corners a little push. And it's not sharp. This is actually quite flat and blunt on the end. See how wide that is? So it's not going to push through and cause your seam to blow out in the corners. Still want to be gentle with it, but I just kind of twist it and turn it. And then I also like to run it right along the edge where there's any seams to kind of push that seam out. All right, I'm going to take this over and press it, and I'll be right back. Okay, there we go. So be very careful when you're pressing waterproof canvas because it can and will melt. Make sure you're only pressing it from the pretty side, not the back side where it has the coating. So now we're going to top stitch using a larger stitch length across the top. Okay. Now I need to find the center. So I'm going to fold this in half. And kind of pinch it to mark my center. I'm going to lay my ruler square along the top edge and on that center mark. And using my chalk roller, you can use a disappearing ink, whatever you're using. You want it to be something that can be wiped away or will come out in the wash or something like that. Well, not out in the wash, that you can use water to get rid of. I'm using chalk because it can be brushed away. So I'm marking a line right down the center. Now, I want to make a 1-inch line on either side of that line as well. So I'm going to put my ruler right on that line. And go ahead and mark a line 1 inch away from the center line on either side. There we go. So now what I want to do is folding it back along the 2 outer lines I'm going to press. So I'll be right back. Alright, so this is what I have now. I've pressed along both of those 2 outer lines so they're nice and crisp. Now I want to fold my work back on that line and with what will be the back side facing up so that you can see the front side of the part you folded back. I'm actually going to top stitch right along that edge at about 1/8 of an inch. And the reason I have this side facing up is because this side is the side that's going to be seen on the exterior of the pocket once we get done with all of our folds. So I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. And I like to make sure that my top edge is lining up. Okay, now we have both of those lines top stitched. So this part is important. We're going to bring both of those top stitched lines, edges, in to meet at that center line. And at this point, everything should line up. Our top edge should line up. Our top stitching that goes across the front of the pocket should line up. So now I'm going to take this over and give it a little press, and then we're going to be ready to move on to attaching it to the lining panel. right, we have one of our lower lining panels, our prepared pocket. Now I'm going to take my lining panel and just fold it in half and give it a little crease so that I can easily find the center. You can also lay it on your grid mat lined up with a particular line and use that to find your center. This works as well. So there's my center line, and you can clearly see that. So now I'm going to take my ruler and measure up 2.5 inches on center from the bottom edge. And I'm going to center my pocket. That center line that I made, I can still see that there, right on that. So I'm going to make sure that that center line is right on the center line of the bag. And now I'm going to stitch right down the center line. Make sure that you're back stitching at the beginning and end to secure everything in place. That's going to reinforce the pocket. So I'm just moving the edges of the pocket panels out of the way there. I'm just going to stitch right down that line. Okay, now that that is in place, that's going to hold my pocket where it needs to be while I attach the rest of the pocket down. So I want to make sure that everything is still lined up at center here. Now you can pin this in place if you'd like. I'm going to start here on this side, so down all the way across the bottom and up the other side, back stitching at the beginning and end. And this is going to secure the bottom of the pocket closed as well. Make sure that everything's laying nice and flat. We've back stitched at the beginning and the end. Clip all of our threads. And there we go. Our slip pocket is now attached to our lining panel. And this is a bit of a dimensional slip pocket, so it's got a little bit more room in there due to these little darts we put in the side. So now we're ready to move on to the next step. All right, we're ready to start assembling our lining panels. So this bit is quite important. We're going to start with the piece that has the pocket attached. That's going to be the back panel. We need to lay out our recessed zipper panel and look at it for just a moment. So when the bag is finished, this needs to sit with the opening to the zipper on the left side of the back panel. So this is the panel that we're going to attach to this panel. So we're going to lay the other one aside with the other piece. And we need one of our upper lining pieces. So we already have the center sort of marked on this piece here. I can still see it. I think you may be able to still see it in the video. I have the center marked on this piece. I need to find the center of this piece. I'm just going to use the lines on my desk here, on my table, to find the center, and I'm going to mark that with a little bit of chalk. And while I have it there, I'm going to go ahead and use it to measure the other side. And mark it as well. So we have our back lining panel lower, our upper panel, and our recessed zipper panel for this side. So to have your zipper oriented the most common way. I'm not going to say correctly because it's not wrong to put it in with the opening to the left. It's just not common practice. So I'm going to take my zipper panel and it's going to get centered right on the center line after I put some double-sided adhesive on these pieces. So I'm going to go across the top of this piece right on the edge. You can use clips however you like here. If you're using vinyl, I do not recommend pens because those will leave marks in your vinyl that don't go away. So I'm also going to put a piece of double-sided tape right across the top edge of this panel as well. That's also going to kind of help my chalk line stay where it needs to be, so I don't accidentally smudge it off. So I don't need to put any on this. I'm going to remove the backing on this one, on my back lining, my lower lining panel. I'm going to go ahead and remove the backing off of this one as well, just so I can see where that center mark is. You can kind of see it right there. I'm going to line that up, oops, right on the center of this panel and make sure that my edges line up nicely. I'm going to kind of press that in place without touching the adhesive there. I didn't do a very good job. There we go. Now I'm going to take my upper piece and lay it face down, centered across the whole thing. If it doesn't stick to my tape there. There we go. Now we can give everything a good press. Everything's lined up nicely. Now we're going to stitch across this edge with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I've backstitched at the beginning and the end. I'm going to pull this away. Now this part is also important. So we're going to turn all of this material up so that the seam allowance is pressed toward the lower part of the lining. Kind of give this a finger press. And now we're going to top stitch on the lower lining at about 1/8 inch using a top stitching length. And that's going to secure the seam allowances to the lower lining. There we go. Now before I move on, so that I don't forget, I want to trim away as much of this excess seam allowance as I can. That way my bag sits nicely when it's finished. So I have my big shears here. And I'm going to go on this side so that I can see this lower panel and know that I'm not cutting into it. There we go. That's also going to help reduce a little bit of the bulk in the side seams. So this is the back panel completed. So we're going to do the same steps on the front panel. The only difference is our recessed zipper panel is going to be facing the other way. It's going to seem weird, but once we turn it and put it right sides together, they'll be facing the same way. And I'll show you that. I'll show you a little example before I start stitching it together. So this piece is going to get laid here. This is going to go this way. But when we turn it over to put everything right sides together, they'll be facing the same direction. Okay? So let's go ahead and put the other half of this together in the same manner we did that one, and I will meet you all at the next step. All right, for this part, we're going to need our front and back lining assembly. And I want to start off by folding my tail of my zipper back out of the way and just clipping it to itself. like that, just so it's not getting in the way of my side seams. You could very much just take a pin if you wanted and just go right through the zipper tape, like so, to keep it out of the way. I just like to clip it. All right, so now we're going to take these two pieces and place them right sides together. Now the first thing I want to line up is my side seam and put a clip there so that it doesn't really move from that point. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Nice and lined up. I'm going to continue clipping around the perimeter, down the sides and across the bottom. Now this part is very important. At your bottom, I'm going to lay my hand here. I'm going to take my chalk and just put a mark. That way I'll know where I want to put my red clips. I like to use my red clips where I'm going to have an opening. So if I get to a red clip, I know that it's time for me to stop stitching and backstitch and skip over a section. So I'm going to make sure that I'm nicely lined up, that my bottom is matched up evenly, and I'm going to pop my red clips right where I made those lines. That's also going to help keep me from wiping them off, so I know where I'm at. All right, so now I'm going to clip down the sides, and then we're going to stitch. Okay, so I'm all clipped. Now this is going to be a part that's quite important. I'm going to start at a 1/2 inch up here at the top until I get down to about right here, just about an inch. A little over an inch actually of stitching. And then I'm going to pivot and move in, just kind of scooch it over a little bit, to a 5/8 inch seam. And for the rest of the way around, down the side, across the two sections that I'm going to stitch on the bottom, and up the other side, I'm going to stay at 5/8 of an inch until I get to about the same spot on the other side. At this point, I'm going to move my seam allowance back out to a 1/2 inch. I want the top seam allowance to match the seam allowance of the exterior of the bag so that they line up neatly. But I want the seam allowance of the lining to be just a little bit more, which is going to make the lining a little bit smaller than the exterior. And that's going to help it to sit really nicely into the exterior of the bag. So let's get this stitching done. So 1/2 inch, I'm going to go ahead and drop my needle down and move that first clip. Back stitching at the beginning and end of each section of stitches. So I'm going to go down a little over an inch maybe. Move that clip out to the edge. I'm going to kind of turn it a little bit. Take a few stitches. Maybe one more. There we go. Now I'm at about 5/8 of an inch, and now I'm going to stitch the rest of the way down the side. And I want to make sure that I backstitch at the bottom. I'm not going to cut my thread, I'm just going to turn my work so that I'm lined up at 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to backstitch at the beginning. Go to right where I hit that line and backstitch. I'll lift my needle up and just scooch everything down, making sure that I'm staying at 5/8 inch. I'm going to do the same thing on this side. Backstitch, and then stitch out to the end and backstitch again. Lift my needle up, turn my work, and then start up the other side, making sure that I'm still at that 5/8 inch seam allowance. At this point, I'm ready to turn out and go a couple of stitches, go about 3 stitches maybe, 4. Let's see where we're at. 1 more. Until we're at 1/2 inch and go to the end and backstitch. So now on either side, you should have this little sloped area of stitching that changes your seam allowance. And that's going to make your lining sit really nicely inside your bag. And we didn't forget our gap in the bottom. So if you don't like the bottom seam on a bag when you close up the bag, you can always put the gap in this side. There's plenty of room in this bag to leave the gap on the side rather than the bottom. All right, so I've pressed open all of my side seams using a pressing cloth. And if you're curious how I do that, I use one of these. So it's one of those shirt sleeve ironing boards that works really great. You can just slip your bag right over it and get right in there. All right, so now we want to box the corners. So the way I have it in the instructions, you grab the front and the back of the bag and pull it out. You can also run your hand up in the inside. Now the most important thing here is to line up this bottom seam and this side seam. We want them to be nice and even. So if you open up this here, it should be in line with that side seam. This is going to make sure that you have a nice square bottom. Square, rectangular, but square corners. Oops. So I'm going to pop a couple of clips on there, and then I'm going to fix the other side. Make sure that seam's lined up. Like so. I'm just going to put 2 because I'm going to go ahead and start stitching again at 5/8 inch seam allowance, just like the side seams on this bag. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Trimmed away my threads. Now I'm going to cut away a good chunk of this excess seam allowance at the corners. And our lining is complete. So that's what we have there. Let me kind of, there we go. So everything sits nicely in there. We have our little gap here at the bottom for turning the bag later. Right here. So now we're ready to move on to the next section. So now we're going to assemble the exterior of the bag. I've already placed double-sided adhesive in the places where I need it, at the top of the lower exterior panel, at the top of all 4 of my pocket lining pieces, and at the bottom of my 2 upper exterior panels. You don't need any on your prepared zipper pieces because they're going to get sandwiched between the pieces that I've already placed tape on, so they're going to stick down just fine. So I'm only going to do one for you on camera because the other one is exactly the same. They're both assembled exactly the same. Once they're assembled, you can decide which piece you want to be your front and which piece you want to be your back. So, to get started, I'm going to move my upper piece aside because I don't need it. And I'm going to move one of my pocket panels aside. So I'm going to start with my lower exterior, 1 pocket lining, and 1 of my prepared 8-inch zippers. So you can clip this if you want. I'm going to be using double-sided adhesive. So making sure, now this part is important, to make sure that your zipper pull is on the left side of both panels. They're done exactly the same. So with your zipper pull facing the left, we're going to flip this piece over and center it. It should be the same width. We're going to center it right on our lower exterior. Looks like mine's just a smidge short, but that's okay. We'll kind of center it with the same amount in excess at the end. I'm going to line up my edge, but I'm trying to make sure that I'm not stretching my zipper tape as I go, because that gives you a wavy zipper. And we don't want wavy zippers. Now right here you may have to manipulate a little bit, because you know how where your zipper pull is, it creates that little lump. And you should be able to kind of see it there on camera. So I'm going to kind of pull it down and then push it up and press that in place, just so that everything stays nice and straight. There we go. Now everything is adhered down nicely. So I'm going to take my pocket lining panel and find my center. And I have a center mark here on the back of my lower panel. So I'm going to transfer that mark to my zipper tape right there, just so that I know where I need to line up that center mark that I've just made by creasing my pocket panel. So I'm going to take off my backing and lining that crease up with the mark that I made, and lining the pocket piece up with the edge, the same edge that my zipper tape is lined up with. I'm going to press that down. So now, using a 1/4 inch seam allowance and a normal stitch length for the material you're using, we're going to stitch across. Back stitching at the beginning and the end. So when we get right up here to where our zipper pull is at, I'm going to hold my material here so that it doesn't move, and I'm going to pull that zipper pull back out of the way. With my needle down, I'm just going to put that pull back where it was. That way we can just stitch on out to the end. Okay, so now I'm going to press, just finger press the lining piece back away from the zipper, just so that it's already in a position that it needs to be. And this stuff finger presses pretty easily. And now I'm going to roll everything back, the seam allowance, the lower panel, and the exterior panel, the lower exterior panel, away from the zipper piece. And then I'm going to top stitch using a longer stitch length for top stitching across the side. And as I go, I'm going to make sure that everything is laying nice and flat. So every time I stop, I'm going to stop with my needle down. I'm going to reach underneath here and make sure that my lining piece is smoothed out, and just use my finger to press the lower lining panel away from the zipper tape. And I'll do this ever so often, just to make sure everything is laying nice. All right, now we're going to pull this away and snip our threads. And we're going to move on to the upper panel part. So I'm going to move this aside for just a moment and bring over my upper lining, or my upper exterior panel, and remove my double-sided adhesive backing. Again, you can clip this as you like. I do not recommend using pins because that can cause some problems. So now, again, centering the pieces, I'm going to line them up, kind of press down the ends, and then I'll work on getting that zipper nice and straight. That little lump right there will drive me nuts, so I'm going to try to fix that. So again, I'm going to use the mark that I have on my upper exterior panel, kind of line my fingernail up with it, and make a mark on my zipper so I can line things up. I'm going to take my other pocket panel, And I could have just skipped that part and just lined it up with the existing pocket panel that's there. So making sure that top edge is nice and straight. And we have everything lined up neatly. I'm going to stitch across here at 1/4 inch. Back stitching at the beginning and end. So I'm going to stop here and reach under here and pull that zipper pull out of the way. And go ahead and stitch off to the end. So this time is a little bit different from the last one. This panel, the pocket lining, is going to stay where it's at. So we're going to flip this up, leaving the lining panel where it is, and we're going to roll back just the upper panel, and we're going to top stitch that. So we're going to be top stitching the seam allowance to the upper panel using a top stitching stitch length. And I will stop periodically just to make sure that everything is laying nice and straight. There we go. So there's our exterior panel with our zipper installed and our pocket linings in place. So this is the point in the instructions where you're instructed to trim off this excess piece of pocket lining material on this. Otherwise, it's going to be kind of hard to get everything closed up because you'll be looking at it from the other side, and you won't be able to see where the bottom of that panel is. So I'm going to leave this facing this way for just a moment while I put a couple of clips on it, just to make sure that those panels continue to lay nice and flat. I'm putting my clips on upside down because this is the side that's going to be up against my work surface when I'm stitching it together. So, laying your panel right side up, we're going to flip back this lower panel. And bring our work underneath our needle. Now, using a 1/2 inch stitch length or seam allowance, I'm going to drop my needle down right at the seam allowance where the zipper panel connects to the lower exterior panel. And I'm going to back stitch at the beginning and end and stitch around at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. It's okay if you go a little bit larger with the seam allowance. We're going to trim away the excess. Now we're going to the same spot on the other side. I'm going to make sure everything is sitting neatly. And we're going to back stitch. Trim away our threads. So now when you're looking at the back of the panel, you can see here that there's going to be a little gap at the top of the pocket where the zipper is at. There shouldn't be any reason why anything would fall out of that gap, anything that's in your pocket, but just in case, I have a way to close those up. So using your top stitching length again, I'm going to come in here and 1/4 inch from the seam, from the top stitching that is already there on the zipper panel. So you can see the top stitching that's already there. We're going to come over 1/4 inch and put another line of top stitching just within the zipper panel. We're going to do that on both sides, and that's going to close up that end of the pocket. So I'm going to drop my needle down 1/4 inch from the other stitch line, right on the joint of the two fabrics, or two materials. I'm going to back stitch once, at the beginning and end. Trim away my threads. And as you can see, that closed up the little gap there at the pocket. So I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, and the other exterior panel is constructed exactly the same. Zipper to the left, the whole 9 yards. So if you need to go to see that done again, you can just rewind to the beginning of this section of the video. And I'm going to go ahead and finish that one up, and we'll move on to the next section. Now it's time to start assembling the exterior of our bag. So I'm going to flip this top piece over so that my panels are right side together. I'm not worried about the side seams at the moment, just this bottom seam. The technique I'm using here will help to ensure that the bottom of our bag lays nice and flat, and we don't have to worry about the seam allowance in the bottom causing the lining to buckle up or the bottom of the bag to not sit flat. So I'm going to stitch all the way across the bottom of the bag using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And back stitching at the beginning and end. I'm going to trim away my threads. And now I'm going to open this up. I'm going to finger press open my seam allowance on the bottom. And I'm going to open it up with that seam allowance open underneath. And I'm going to top stitch down both sides of that seam, making sure that seam allowance stays open as I go. So I'm going to back stitch once at the beginning and end. It's within the seam allowance, so it's not too big a deal. And I can feel with my finger as I go that this seam allowance is staying open. And I'm just going to spin it around and go right back down the other side, making sure that that seam allowance is pressed in this direction. Okay, I'm going to trim away my threads. And now we have a nice finished bottom. It's got a little bit of a decorative bit. Granted, it's on the bottom. Nobody's ever going to see it unless they're picking up your bag to look at the bottom of it, but you know it's there, right? And it's going to lay nice and flat. So now we're going to fold this in half with the right sides together. The part I want you to focus on getting straight at first and clipping together are these side seams. So this is a highly contrasting material. We've got white on black, and we want that seam to line up on the side. That way it doesn't look like we didn't care when we put it together. So I'm going to put clips there to start with, and I'm also going to do the same thing on the other side. So I want that lined up. So now you can go ahead and clip down the rest of the side if you want. I'm not going to. Those clips there are kind of holding everything nicely, and I'm not going to be speeding through this or anything, so I kind of know where I'm starting and finishing it, and I'm going to make sure it's lined up as I go. And this is going to be stitched at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now when I get right here, I'm not going to take my clips out, but I'm just going to kind of hold everything in place. There we go. You may have to give it a little push to get it under your foot there. Make sure everything is still lined up, and off we go. And don't forget to backstitch. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. So now we're ready to go ahead and box our corners on the bottom. So I want to press open my seam allowance here on the side. I won't be taking this one to the iron like I did before, but I can take my fingers inside and really just give it a good press. So if you want to trim back some of the seam allowance on the lining portion or the exterior portion, I would go from about here, a couple inches up from the bottom and a couple inches down from the top. I wouldn't do this part. The only part I am going to trim is this part. Now, the reason I leave this at the bottom is because I want to be able to press it open, and if I've only got this tiny little bit of material, I'm going to struggle with pressing it open. So just like we did on the lining, we're going to press this open here. Pull out the sides, and I'm going to feel on the inside and make sure that those seams are lined up. And you can actually open up your bag and line up the seams this way. And just feel along. I'm going to put a few clips right across here, and then I'm going to do the other side. And now we're going to stitch across using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to take my scissors and trim away a good part of that excess, leaving about 1/4 inch. And that is our exterior panel constructed. Next, we're going to be attaching our strap connectors to our exterior panel while it's still inside out. So I've decided that I want this panel over here to be my front. So I'm going to lay my bag down with my rear panel, the back panel, flat on my surface, and I'm going to kind of skew the bag to the side and push the upper portion out of the way so that I can see clearly the back panel and the seam. So I'm going to take my ruler and measure down at 1 inch, and then I'm going to place my strap connector with the D-ring out of the way, 1 inch down and about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam. And then I'm going to stitch that in place by stitching, since I'm using rivets, I'm only going to go across here at the top and about 1/4 of an inch from the bottom. So with that, holding that in place, I'm going to slide it over. You can even use some double-sided adhesive to hold it where you want it. I'm going to slide it over and extend my stitch length because that's a lot of material to go through. I'm going to drop my needle down right there at the stitch line that's already there. All right, there's the top. And I'm going to move it down so that I'm 1/4 inch from the bottom, approximately. Right, so for the other strap connector, still on the back panel, I'm just going to kind of roll everything over and skew it in the opposite direction. Place my ruler down right up against the seam allowance and right on the top edge on the 1 inch line. Now I'm going to take my strap connector and about 1/8 of an inch from the seam and 1 inch down, place that down, move my D-ring out of the way, or in this case my triangle ring, and stitch in place the same as I did to the other side. There we are. So now we have the strap connectors connected to the back panel of the bag. I'm going to go ahead and trim away any strings or thread that I have missed and apply my rivets, and I will meet you back for the bag construction. Okay, we're almost ready to finish up this bag. So I've done a little bit of prep by using some double-sided adhesive to hold my seam allowances open. You can take a little bit of time to do that yourself, or you can just hold them open as you clip everything together. So I have my lining piece and my exterior piece. Now I've already added my brand label, so if you're going to do a brand label or anything like that, you'll want to add that a little bit earlier on. I have my strap connectors on, so I'm going to move my connector down out of the way. You're going to want your exterior to be right side out and your lining to be right side in, just the way it would be when the bag was finished. So what we're going to do is we're going to scrunch up our exterior. I know. And we're going to stuff it into our lining, but this is important. The back side of your exterior needs to be against the side with the pocket, so that when we turn it out, our zipper is going to open from the left. So the side, the panel that has the strap connectors, needs to be against the side with your slip pocket on the inside. So we're going to put that down in there. Now this is important. At this point, we're going to push our recessed zipper panels down out of the way. We're just going to kind of scooch them down. We're going to make sure that our D-rings, or in my case these triangle rings, are out of the way. And now I'm going to line up my side seams and clip in place. On both sides. Starting with my side seams. You can squish and maneuver your bag however you need to get it where you need it to be, to make sure that everything is lined up. Now I'm going to match up the center marks that I made on the exterior portion of my bag. Again, making sure that that bit is pushed out of the way. So I'm going to line up that center mark and put a clip. And I missed a center mark on this side, it looks like. So everything should be even. So I'm going to guess it's center on this side. It'll be okay. So I'm going to match up the spots in between the clips that I've just applied. You may have to kind of ease it down in a couple of spots. That's okay. Now I'm going to go over to the machine, and starting on the back side of the bag, I'm going to sew at a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around. So I've dropped my needle down. I'm going to kind of scooch my clips out toward the edge of the fabric. I can leave them on there, or the material. And I'm going to stitch around. I am going to back stitch at the beginning and end. I just want to make sure that everything stays lined up nicely. You can kind of maneuver things around as you need to. So this is where we're at currently. I get my sleeves pulled up here, get ready to do this part. So I've got a hole here that is about the width of my hand. So I'm going to carefully start pulling the bottom of the bag out through that hole. Now I made sure I backstitched here, but we still want to be careful that we don't rip any stitches. So what I like to do is gently kind of press and pull and rotate it as I go. Now I can grab this up here and kind of start pushing the top in. That's also going to help so that things aren't so mushed up inside. And we can kind of pull this up from here. There we go. Clip popped off, but that's quite all right. Make sure our corners are poked out. I'm even going to run my hand down in here and make sure we have everything poked out nicely here. See how nice and flat that bottom is with the finish there? Okay, so those edges should be nice and straight. You can either hand stitch this if you'd like, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to stitch right on the edge of the material. Let me put a couple more clips on there. But before I do that, because I've used waterproof canvas and I've used waterproof canvas on the lining and I've used vinyl on the exterior, it creates a balloon, if you can see here. So I'm actually going to roll this up until I kind of push all of the air out. And I want to do that before I stitch that bottom shut. Otherwise I'm going to trap some air in there. It'll be a little bit harder to get everything the way it's supposed to be. So we're going to go over to the machine and sew right across there. Okay, I can push that out of the way. Now I sew at about 1/16 of an inch. I drop my needle down right in the edge of the material and sew right on the edge of the material, making sure that I'm lining both sides up. And backstitch at the beginning and the end. So I want to make sure that I'm catching both sides of that as I go across there. You can stop and start as many times as you need to make sure that you're catching it. Yep. I'm going to heat seal my threads just so they don't ravel. And you can see there, there's the bottom side and the top side just on the edge of the fabric, and it is caught all the way. So there's not that much of a little pucker in the bottom. Okay, let's go back over to the counter for a moment. So this is what we have currently. I'm going to take it and push the lining down into the exterior of the bag. And kind of square out my bottom. Now it doesn't look quite right, that's because it's not. We're going to push this in and roll this down. I probably should have used white thread on that, but it's okay. I'm going to grab my clips. I'm going to clip this as I go. Just to make sure that everything is lined up. So now I can really get in there and press that bottom down. And you can see how nicely the lining of the bag fits in the exterior. So now we're going to go over and top stitch at 1/4 inch from the edge. We want to make sure we're top stitching on the exterior. So I'm actually going to, before we go over to the machine, I'm going to flip this kind of inside out because we want the pretty part of our top stitching to be on the exterior, and that's going to be the top thread. So if you have a free arm machine, or if your domestic has the removable part so that you can slip it on, then great. Unfortunately, with my machine, I have to turn it inside out to get the top stitching the way I like. So I'm just going to take it and maneuver it. It doesn't have to be all the way inside out. Just as long as I have this top turned out like so. And I'm going to make sure these are folded out of the way. So I don't have to push that out, just as long as I can lay the bag like so, and I can top stitch along there. So I will see you over at the machine. So I'm going to start at the back of the bag. At the seam on the side. Get those threads out of the way, and I'm going to really crank up my stitch length a little bit, especially here on the side. That's quite a bit to go through. Move these two clips out of the way because those are going to be a little bothersome. And now I'm going to back stitch. I know it's kind of hard for you to see. There we go. And I want to make sure that I keep these recessed panels out of the way as well. Stop as often as you need to kind of manipulate your bag however you need it. I put my clips on upside down. I'm going to go ahead and trim these threads out of the way. And there we go. Our top stitching is all done. So now we're going to go back over to the counter and turn our bag out. So now I can just grab this and pull it right back out. And there's our lining all attached. Top stitching looks really nice around there. This will get steamed indirectly. You can use a pressing cloth and press directly, but I like to use just steam indirectly and then just really rub over it with my pressing cloth while it's still nice and hot, and that'll smooth out most of those wrinkles you get from turning and things like that. It works really well with the vinyl. So now next step is I'm going to add my zipper pull to my recessed zipper panel. All right, so I brought my ironing board up here so that I could clamp my fork to it. And I'm going to pop my zipper pull right onto the edge of the tines and kind of flip my bag so that my tails are at the top and I can reach them easily. I want to make sure that my zipper ends end up lining up. First time. Yay! Okay. Now I can push that off. Just move this whole contraption out of the way for a minute. And now we're going to zip that closed. And that panel sits really nice right in there. Okay, so I'm going to put my zipper end on now. Now, if you're going to use a zipper tab, you can sew that on now. I like using the metal zipper ends. It adds a little bit of weight to the end of the zipper. So with the zipper flipped upside down, I'm going to fold the ends toward the back and insert that into my zipper end, and this is a large zipper end. Pop my screw right up there. And tighten that right down. And that zipper end is complete. I'm going to tuck that right down in the bag. And so here is the completed bag. I hope you all enjoy making this bag as much as I do. This pattern has been a labor of love. It started off with a commission for a client, and they enjoyed the bag, and I loved the bag that I made for them so much that I ran with it and turned it into my first pattern. So I have a lot of other pattern ideas running through my head, so hopefully keep an eye out for those soon. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave it in the comment section below or send me an email. You'll find that in the bottom right corner of the pattern. Thank you so much for sticking out to the end of this video, and I hope it helps if you have any issues making it through the text portion, because I'm not always the best at describing things. Thank goodness for the testers. Oh, don't forget about the Going Rogue section at the bottom of the pattern. I'm the world's worst when it comes to not sticking to the constraints of a pattern. I like to color outside the lines, and if you do too, please feel free to do that with this pattern, and I would love to see what you make.